All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the topic lecture for our college programming for the summer in 2021. We're so excited to have you all here, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm excited to join you all for a few days and actually get a start to this year's topic, which I'm actually very excited about. It's very dense and gets into a lot of legal literature, but I think it's something that is really interesting to learn about and especially like get into the nitty gritty of. And so with that, welcome to the Antitrust Topic Lecture. My name is Caitlin Walrath. I'm the Chief Executive of Operations for Debate Boutique LLC, and we're so excited for you to join us this summer. So a brief roadmap of what I'll be going over. First, I'll be discussing what is antitrust and kind of some of the key terminology and like different things that will help us kind of get our heads around what exactly we're talking about and what kind of trends we're looking for when we're thinking about researching this topic and what pertains to the conversation of antitrust. And then secondly, we'll look at a timeline of antitrust, and it will be a brief timeline. It certainly won't cover everything because there are hundreds and hundreds of different legal cases, but we'll talk about kind of the four major points in history and themes and what contributed to the development of antitrust law and the different political processes that have gotten to us to where we are today. And then third, we will talk about the history of the Sherman Act of 1890, which is, in my mind, considered the foundational law of antitrust in the United States, as well as it is what spurred and is the foundation for future iterations of different antitrust laws. So I think it's important to look at, and spoiler alert, the policy app that you all will be receiving if you're part of the Debate Boutique program will be centered around the Sherman Act. So that's no surprise that I wanted to talk a little bit about it to give you all some foundation and understanding of what we'll be doing. And then finally, we'll end the conversation on a discussion of where we are now, the impact of Trump's administration, as well as like different platforms and how they exist. And then also a discussion of how Biden has changed things and what the potential future of this topic looks like and different potential issues that may arrive through the passage of different things. And so with that, let's get into the conversation of what is antitrust. And so I have 6 key terms here that I will be using and referencing in different ways throughout this lecture. And so I wanted to use these as a foundational tool to get us introduced. So the first thing I want to introduce is what is a trust? And so a trust is typically in the conversation of corporations or businesses is when a large grouping of business interests with significant market power, so they own a lot of the shares or the different means of production in different areas of different industries, so like factories, office buildings, whatever, so they can control the outcome of that market, so to speak, which may be embodied as a corporation or a group of corporations that cooperate with one another in various ways. And typically what makes a trust distinct from other kind of corporate partnerships or like mergers or something like that is a trust is when a corporation will entrust its assets and the operations of its business to another set of trustees. So these could be board members or whatever, or a different trust. So usually like a CEO or differently. And so these were bigger back in like the 1800s or about the Second Industrial Revolution, where corporations were able to basically convince other business owners that because they had their own successful business, that it would be better for them to manage their assets and they would make them more successful business owners. So it did not require formal buyout or combination of different companies, but it still did all operate under one controller. And so trusts were basically the inspiration for the creation of antitrust law, which was meant to target those that had been formed and that were seen as hindering economic competitiveness and growth. And so with that, antitrust, what we mean by that these are the regulations that encourage competition by limiting the market power of any particular firm. This often involves ensuring that mergers and acquisitions don't overly concentrate market power or form monopolies, as well as breaking up those that have. And so over time, because trust became like the not the main form of how corporations would engage in monopolization. Things like mergers and whatever became the target of antitrust. But the spirit of it is to break up the idea that any one person or any group of persons should be able to control an entire industry, whether it's through given consent or whether it's not through buyouts or things like that. And the idea is that collusion and collusions and the like also can pertain to monopolization, because people can be working together to manipulate markets, because, it doesn't just take one board or one person to do a thing. And so investigations became a key component of antitrust law in order to predict and prevent potential attempts at monopolization. And so the third term I want to introduce is a market. What do we mean by, them being able to control these markets? And so a market is typically just a means by which the exchange of goods and services takes place as a result of buyers and sellers being in contact with one another, either directly or through mediating agents or institutions. And so typically what this meant initially were like literally the physical markets, or like physical places you would go to buy and sell goods or barter for goods. But as time went on, goods and what we exchange our money and currency for became less physical and more abstract, and more about services and things that you get on the internet and intellectual property and all of that stuff. And so markets have expanded to not just refer to those physical places where we go, but kind of anywhere where this exchange and buying and selling is occurring. And so there are many different markets, and there are many different opportunities at monopolization of these things, which means that the system has a lot to kind of investigate and deal with, which is why strong enforcement is typically preferred over weak enforcement, because it means that they can keep up with this ever expanding kind of understanding of marketization in different arenas in which the buying and selling of goods can be taken place. And so it helps us understand the different geographical scope that different acts may apply to, based off of how they change or decide to change or expand the scope of different core antitrust laws that exist in the United States. And then the fourth thing we'll talk about is competition. So competition in this case, and then in the case of economics and business, is a scenario where different economic firms are in contention to obtain goods that are limited by varying elements of market mix, so price, product, promotion, and place. So the idea is that there are a lot of different firms or different companies offering either the same product or different products. They will compete with each other in order, or they will engage in competition. They will engage in actions such as changing their prices or engaging in different promotional schemes, like trying to sell it to you, so different like advertisements or different ways of marketing. Additionally, they will maybe slightly change their product or the description of what it is, change their prices, the ingredients, where it's sold, etc., in order to make it more likely that you choose to buy their product versus someone else. And the idea is that a healthy market, competition is high, so there are a lot of different corporations, a lot of different products, a lot of different things being offered that allows the consumer to effectively choose and exert control over which products will continue to be successful versus not. And low competition happens when corporations are able to take over large portions of those market shares, so the products are all being offered by the same individual, so there's no incentive for them to improve upon those things or change how they do them, because they get the profit no matter what. And so antitrust is concerned and often referred to as competition law, because it is concerned with injecting more of this into markets in order to combat things like monopolization, etc. And by monopolization, what is a monopoly? No, it is not just the board game. Monopoly refers to when a company or its product offerings dominate an entire sector of industry. The most commonly percentage that I see thrown around is what determines whether or not one has attained a monopoly market share is somewhere around 50%. So when you're able to control or determine the vast majority of available shares or power within any given market. And so you're able to ultimately dictate the decisions outside of just general competition or offering the best product. And so this can describe total control, where someone has 100% control, or near total control, which is that 50% upwards range. And so that will change based off how the AF describe, and a potential AF would describe how they expand the scope of these laws depending on what monopolies they actually end up impacting and whatnot. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. And then the final term that I'll introduce is this idea of anti-competitive behavior. And there are a lot of different definitions of what is pursued, or what is considered anti-competitive, but in general, it's the idea that you should not engage in restricted practices, i.e. practices that involve outright agreements to raise the price or reduce the quantity produced, but ultimately just reduce competition. So like when companies collude together to decide what products they have, they're not allowing consumers to choose which product is better, but rather they are determining how the consumers should decide in the first place. Or things like mergers make it impossible for consumers to be able to choose between different corporations because they no longer exist, and same with trust, et cetera, et cetera. So it's attempting to limit that type of behavior. Now, other parties have also determined things like anti-competitive behavior to include things like governmental regulation, or things that hinder the ability for corporations to engage in outright competition, i.e. they are not able to determine all of the grounds in which they are able to change their productive process in order to get the most efficient price or the best product possible, because the government will prevent them from taking certain actions. Or anti-competitive has been determined before to strike out things like unions, because they fight for their workers and require certain regulations, which ultimately hinder businesses' ability to compete, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is a very loose term, but it's important to understand how any given AF determines what it sees as anti-competitive behavior, not only for T reasons, but also for understanding the scope of solvency and kind of the different actions that they must take in order to solve their AF. All right, and so with that, those are the terms for antitrust and kind of our foundational knowledge. And so if you want to take a second to pause and reflect, you may, and I'll give a couple minutes or a couple seconds in the video for you to do so. All right, and with that, the next thing we'll talk about is I'll introduce our timeline of antitrust, and then kind of the four main sections we'll talk about, and then we'll get a little bit more into the weeds of them. And so the first section is from 1900 to 1920, which is the kind of period that follows the breakup of Standard Oil and steel and all of these other big trusts that the Sherman Act of 1890 attempted to target, as well as the iteration upon the Sherman Act, things like the Clayton and Federal Trade Commission Acts, in order to ensure that there was effective enforcement and widespread enforcement of these things. The second period was from the 1920s to the 1930s, where we saw actually a pause in antitrust litigation or antitrust enforcement, because the looming Great Depression, as well as the economic constraints being put on the United States, led to a necessity and drive for cooperation between the private industry and the federal government, and to set up the foundations and create the momentum for things like the New Deal, which would include never before seen kind of government intervention and regulation that would be rendered or understood as anti-competitive for the first time in basically all of the US's history, at least for this era. And then from the 1940s to the 1970s, we have the golden era of antitrust, when we see the most enforcement, the biggest iterations, and kind of the biggest use of the antitrust laws. And then from the 1970s to basically the present, we see the fallout of the adoption of the Chicago Boys School of Economic Thought, and kind of the move towards unregulated free market capitalism and kind of the fallout of that. And so you'll see that the history of antitrust really covers a wide breadth of issues, and kind of is fundamental in many ways to the evolution of the economy and different socioeconomic developments in the United States. And so I think this topic is going to be really interesting into investigating those and kind of reflecting on those histories and things. And with that being said, let's get into the deeper timeline. And so we'll start with the 1900 to the 1920 period. And so this was the period that, in response to ever evolving anti-competitive business practices, multiple laws were passed in order to clarify and form the base foundation, the Sherman Act, into a much more useful tool to kind of adapt to these newer practices, which birthed things like the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act. And so the passage of the Sherman Act in 1890 was what set the stage. And the act was initially designed to, quote, be a comprehensive charter of economic liberty aimed at preserving free and unfettered competition as the rule of trade. And so the idea of this law is it was meant to outlaw anti-competitive activities like price fixing or mergers or monopolization, et cetera. And it also required and included for the first time criminal penalties for such actions, such as jail or fines. Because prior to the Sherman Act, the only real recourse that consumers and different smaller businesses had for anti-competitive behavior was to go through corporate law, which only had civil penalties associated with it. And so this passage was very important in order to create kind of a teeth and actual consequence to engaging in these behaviors. And the reason it was spurred on and became what it was is because American business interests like Standard Oil and steel, rail, sugar, etc., were spiking prices and undermining the quality of goods to such a large degree that the government felt it was necessary to take action, as well as it spurred on by popular support. And so, after the passage of that, we have a couple decades of action. But by 1914, agencies and courts and the federal government realized that corporations had to move their tactics away from just engaging in trusts to engaging in things like murders or mergers as well, not murders, mergers, as well as other predatory practices, including collusion of price fixing or overhyping the value of different companies, etc. And so the passage of the Clayton Act of 1914 gave that power to agencies and courts in order to break the force at the outset of its moment before it gathered momentum. So to give the predictive and preventative ability to prevent monopolization before it could ever occur. So the idea of investigating what is seen as a legitimate merger versus a not legitimate merger, and gave more clarification for what those things would look like. And then finally, the Federal Trade Commission Act was also passed in 1914, and this what it did in relation to the Clayton Act is it created a new federal agency that was empowered and given resources that to make it capable of watching out for these anti-competitive practices. So it was empowered to actually investigate and stop them. And eventually it would team up with a subdivision of the Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, to create kind of a dual-pronged system for investigating and targeting different antitrust litigation cases. And so that was that period. And then from the 1920s to the 1930s, we see that the Great Depression left many in quite the sticky of situations where they don't have jobs, they're not able to provide for their families, and the government did not have the safety nets in place in order to protect populations. And so the government decided to put antitrust on the side because it wanted to engage in behavior that potentially would violate the acts, the previous acts, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, the FTC Act, in order to kind of engage with elements of a planned economy in order to stimulate growth. And so the government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt focused on things like pseudo-nationalization or state-sanctioned cartelization, i.e. where companies would retain ownership but would collude with the federal government in order to fix the price of goods. So they would receive subsidies or different types of money in order to keep the price of goods affordable for the average worker or to encourage them to hire different workers. And they did this for a various number of industries in order to create a safety net for the population during this incredibly rough times. And it turns out state ownership turning to fascism or whatever the American politics thinks wasn't a fear yet, and the American people ended up benefiting greatly for it, although it did obviously occur in unequal fashion, as everything does in America. And so questions of state interference on things like competition or fairness weren't widely discussed because people really just wanted help during this period. Additionally, what happened is this is also when the rule of reason analysis was adopted by the Supreme Court in order to allow greater flexibility for businesses to directly manage markets through industry standards rather than just pure governmental dictation. And so the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the FTC Act, they had broad statutes and broad directions for what different federal agencies should do in order to engage in antitrust or to break up anti-competitive behavior, but like didn't really clarify exactly how they should be interpreted. And so this rule of reason analysis allowed inputs from corporations to give courts a sense of what was considered reasonable or necessary for maintaining the health of markets without going too far and preventing fair but hard competition. And so it was an attempt to balance the needs of businesses with the needs of the government and an attempt at regulation. And so this is also where the concept of the idea that an intent to engage in anti-competitive behavior or the effects of such anti-competitive behavior became the standard for evaluating blame or whether or not someone could be actually prosecuted on antitrust rather than just engaging in the act at all, because there is such thing as an accidental monopolization or whatnot. And so this became known or became the foundation for eventual narrowing and in scope of how these acts should be applied. And so that brings us to the 1940s to the 1970s period, where competition was seen as the cure-all to the idea of fascism in the world, and antitrust was seen as the key to that. And so there were perceived fascist orders spreading throughout the world. Often they were just communist nations, but that's neither here nor there. Basically, the idea was if you have a planned economy, you're evil, and that's awful because it hurts growth. And so places in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America were having these different implementations of planned economies, state-owned economies. And the United States identified this as artificially limiting competition and undermining growth, which needed to be addressed and fought against. And so Friedrich Hayek in Europe and the UK at the time became a big fan of the idea that private enterprise was always better than a planned economy, though it cannot be totally free. And so he pushed governments to adopt the idea that they are able to create the healthy conditions for markets that can balance growth and human well-being. And antitrust could be the effective tool to engage in that. But we should not use effective antitrust to such a degree that it would result in over-government regulation and undermining of the markets. And so many individuals at this time were faced with a very hard choice of how much behavior should be limited, what should be engaged with, etc. But it was a conversation still. And so it's considered the golden era of antitrust because we see there are constant cases and litigations and evolutions of our understanding of monopolization, what is fair competition, how to effectively balance markets, that we don't see in any other period. And so this is the kind of timeline where we see the most happening. Of course, however, that leads us to our last time period, which is the 1970s to the present, or known as the terror of the Chicago Boys. And so the Chicago School of Economic Thought rose to prominence with the Reagan administration when it fully kicked into gear. And the Chicago School of Thought was heralded by an economist, Milton Friedman, at the University of Chicago, who believed in the idea of a completely unregulated free market, complete laissez-faire capitalism, that no government regulation should ever exist because that will always undermine competitions. And he believed that markets will be able to correct themselves, market forces were that strong, and that consumer welfare, i.e. whether or not consumers are impacted by these market practices, which is a really amorphous term and not really determined, should be all antitrust should be concerned with. It shouldn't be concerned with non-economic concerns or impacts, which ended up undermining enforcement as it gets adopted by Reagan and eventually a bunch of other nations, including in places like Chile, Argentina, and the UK. Which I'll plug a documentary here. If you watch The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, I think she does a great job covering the idea of Milton Friedman's capitalism and kind of what it did to the world. But anyways, it means basically all antitrust enforcement stops. except of course against actual like drug cartels and other things, because Reagan also had his war on drugs, so he was never going to stop down enforcement on that. And so basically we see all of antitrust die except in the case of cartels. And we see that at the same period, vertical mergers were also becoming popular again, and they basically virtually were unlitigated, and now they were scot-free completely. And so it means that antitrust has fundamentally narrowed over the years and has continued to narrow and weaken because it's not been utilized for many decades. An unregulated industry has continued unabated, with kind of all caution thrown to the wind, because there's still the fundamental belief that markets will correct themselves. But what I hope we understand kind of going through this timeline, and then ultimately kind of after a year's worth of debate over this topic, we'll understand that markets probably shouldn't be fully unregulated. And I think that that is a common sentiment that is rising throughout the United States as well as around the world. So I'm very interested to see how that plays out in different debates and everything. All right, and with that, now let's talk about the Sherman Act of 1890. And so there are a lot of things that contributed to the passage of the act, and a lot of different political processes, but there are a couple things I want to highlight. The first is the Grange movement, which was an agrarian, which means like rural, usually focused on farmland or those different types of productive capacities, an agrarian populist political movement that was mostly centered in the Midwest and the West, that created momentum against corporate capitalism and railroad privileges, because mostly they were upset that railroad companies and the different trusts and monopolies that existed at the time were able to price fix to such a degree that it made it impossible for those in rural areas or different farm communities to really transport their goods effectively or go anywhere unless they already had like kind of a sweet deal or like were friends with the railroad company so that they could get railroad privileges. And so it created a lot of resentment along low-class workers or lower-class workers, as well as individuals who were not able to kind of engage in this form of crony capitalism. And so they became known for pushing and convincing people that we need to move against big corporations and engage in antitrust busting. And so the ultimate effects of this movement is it ingrained a deep hostility towards political corruption and state-granted privileges, because those things were seen as being tied intimately to the creation of these trusts, as well as kind of the foundations for how they were able to accumulate so much power, i.e. the government subsidies are what allowed them to buy out other companies or and show other corporations that they were trustworthy trustees and basically get ownership of their companies, which we now see today in kind of a warped vision, even still in the Rust Belt states and Western politics, as kind of the more conservative talking point, which is big government is bad because it ends up hurting workers, which really it started out with the reasons big government is bad is because they only benefit and only give money to big corporations. They don't give it to the people. So it's interesting to see how those things have been warped today. And then the second big thing that the Grange movement contributed to is that populism, i.e. the idea of popular support or whipping up national momentum in a time period, proved to be crucial to periods of strong antitrust and the creation of strong enforcement, because regulation would ride out the support of that. And that's the only thing that forced politicians to kind of turn down lobbyist money and actually listen to the people. And so I think that's an interesting point to come to, because I think we're in the middle of another kind of populist wave now that is kind of criticizing and investigating the roles of big corporations and kind of how much power they have over our lives, how much of the market they dominate, etc. And so that's the Grange movement. And so that kind of created the popular sentiment and the foundations for the creation of antitrust. The second was the foundations of the Sherman Law lie in a common law doctrine for contracts, the idea of restraint of trade, which is focused on coercion, i.e. actions or agreements that impact the freedom of certain parties to act through covenants created by businesses. So covenants are arranged agreements where you have to meet the terms of them before you do business. So some of these things would be like non-compete clauses, i.e. you will not develop a product that is similar to ours, or will not develop an IP that's similar to ours, such that you could compete with us, and that you can't do that. Or price fixing arrangements, where they'll be like, if you're taking your intellectual property, you have to sell it for at least this much because this is what I want to sell it for. And so these artificially undermine competition because you're only able to basically do business or engage in agreements with different things if you engage in engage in processes that are not reflective of market force or consumer welfare. Hence, they're being anti-competitive. It's also worth noting that covenants also operated on alongside racial lines for many years, not only in things like housing, where there were racial covenants that excluded anyone who was not white from living in certain places, but also in case of businesses, i.e. you were not allowed to do commerce with if a covenant said that there's a racial covenant that said you had to be a member of the Caucasian race. And if you were not a member of that, you were not able to do business, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was a large driver of wealth inequality and inadequate access to proper litigation or protection from predatory practices that we see reflected in United States politics. The third kind of thing that contributed to the creation of the Sherman Act was from 1889 to 1895, so in the period about right when it was passed and was still trying to figure out how to enforce it. Corporate law, so that's the law that was used prior to the creation of antitrust or competition law, was able to be utilized by 5 states in order to prosecute well-known trust. And so there was this idea that the act would actually be useful and very successful, because if they are already able to manipulate corporate law in such a way, there must be reasonable room and justification for a criminal penalty and application as well. And so the Sherman Act was seen as the reasonable response kind of to that legal movement that was taking place. And then finally, the Sherman Act was passed. It was sponsored by Senator John Sherman of Ohio, and included 2 key sections that forbade combinations and restraint of trade and monopolization in order to impact those practices. Because they were dissatisfied with the glacier progress of things like corporate law, Democrats and Republicans got together to support John Sherman in order to create the Antitrust Act of 1890 in order to, quote, ensure competitive markets across state lines. And so corporations like Standard Steel and Oil and Sugar and Rail had gotten too big and needed to be busted, and ultimately ended up being so. However, because of disagreements on how the final bill should be written, the final bill would only broadly outline existing common law that already existed. It basically codified it without giving any clarification on how it should be applied or interpreted. So courts were still kind of left in the air about what exactly to do. And so the breakup of trust in response to price fixing became an early focal point for litigation on the issue, but it quickly lost focus as corporations adapted and created new means of engaging in monopolization, which has led to years of confusion and split over what the intended meaning of the bill should be. The act, however, did grant the federal government the capacity to pursue criminal remedies in response to such behavior, which was good in the case of like actually creating a deterrent effect. And there's still a split over whether or not the intent of the bill is meant to protect consumer welfare or benefit consumers, or whether or not competition is an a priori issue, and that protection of small competitors should be the focus, which has also contributed to the conflicting and confusing interpretations of the law that has also set the stage for a lot of the controversies that I think we'll face this year in debate. Everything from like what is considered an anti-competitive practice to how should those things be weighed and what kind of penalties should be applied to them, to what does it mean for a corporation to have intent to engage in those practices, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing I kind of want to mention again is, unfortunately, because of these ever-changing standards of what anti-competitive means or whatever, the Sherman Act ended up being used against unions and other government regulations for the sake of the freedom of market, which means that the Chicago Boys functionally reversed the initial intent and focus on consumer behavior. So that definitely is going to be at the core of the topic this year. And so, yeah, that's kind of the Sherman Act. And then the last thing I want to talk with you all about today is, where are we at today? What does all of this mean? How do we start interpreting or thinking about researching the topic? And so I think the two big controversial areas outside of just like general revival of antitrust law and like economic competition are, one, in the digital arena. There are huge platforms like Amazon and Google and Microsoft and all these other corporations who have functional monopolies over the market and face constant litigation, yet seem to kind of always skate by either slaps on the wrist or not really any enforcement at all. And while these cases are still ongoing, there's a lot of litigation that's occurring. I think it's going to be relevant to kind of keep up and understand how these cases are going to play out, because I think it will speak a lot to what we can expect from the Biden administration, as well as from future administrations, as well as judicial decisions on antitrust law, and kind of what the next evolution or next stage of antitrust will look like, whether or not it will be continuation of these same Reaganite / like Chicago Boys policies, or whether it will be a return to kind of the more FDR New Deal period, where or I guess post New Deal period, where we engaged in the golden age of antitrust busting and all of that. The second big arena, I think, is the international arena, especially as conversations and over potential competition and conflict with China arises, given that they have a very planned economy where the state helps run it all, even though they still engage in capitalist principles and whatnot. And especially as that competition and the conversations center around things like corporate challenges, as well as ownership over digital platforms and censorship of information, the conversation of antitrust in the international context is not going to go away. And so I think it's interesting and will be something to keep an eye on, to see how different bills or different actions are taken against these different corporations, as well as what the impacts for certain apps would be if we clarify domestic law, how we are going to go about applying those things overseas in litigation where we're attempting to protect our own corporations and stuff like that. And so with those two areas being said, I also just want to talk about our last president and the current one. So Trump, he was still really terrible when it came to antitrust. Like, he rolled back a bunch of regulation enforcement because obviously he hated regulations and hated government bureaucracy, and basically compounded decades of decline suffered by antitrust. And he talked a big game about cutting down on cartels and mergers, but his enforcement was extremely lenient. For all the big game, he talked about draining the swamp. Like, for example, from 2017 to 2018, there were 0 newly opened monopolization investigations by the Department of Justice, which is the longest span of inattention in 50 years. So, like, he really didn't care despite as much as he talked about it. However, it's very surprising he has spurred a movement on the conservative side by getting banned from Twitter. And now there's this huge movement about whether or not big tech has too much say in our lives and whether or not their censorship should be tolerated anymore. And so I think it's interesting to see the evolving political conversation, whereas antitrust used to have just been purely partisan. It's now moving to be a more bipartisan issue, but maybe for like different justifications. So parsing those things will be interesting. I also think it's important to note that under Trump, there was 0 recalibration of any of the agencies or enforcement protocols that exist for antitrust to match the new realities of the markets, such as like digital platforms that are offered by Google, as well as the evolution of different industries like Amazon, Tesla, like all that kind of stuff, emerging space industry, all that. And so this new atmosphere kind of leaves them unprepared and kind of behind where they should be in their investigations. And so I think that this will impact the time frame of which we understand in which asks play out and how enforcement will go about it. So yeah, that's Trump. And Biden, actually just a couple days ago, he nominated Jonathan Kanter to run the DOJ's antitrust division, which is an interesting choice because Jonathan Kanter used to be a private antitrust lawyer that represented Microsoft as well as other companies who ended up suing Google over a variety of antitrust statutes. And given that the DOJ is currently trying to get a case against Google and kind of has an ongoing prosecution of that. It's really interesting that Biden picked him despite those potential conflicts of interest and everything. So we'll be interested to see whether or not he actually ends up getting nominated and how he'll work with Lena Khan of the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, and to see whether or not they'll actually engage in antitrust busting or kind of wider litigation against this. It's definitely shaken up things considerably over time. Additionally, Biden has talked a very big game, but doubts are floating that he'll take any substantive action. Like, he has passed an executive order or two to promote competition in markets and the economy by targeting mergers, price fixing, and other bad behavior. But like, really, all of these actions are kind of toothless without legislation backing them up. And that's mostly because of how courts are wired to interpret different law and whatnot. Executive orders do not operate on the same level as legislation, so they're not determining overall the language of which courts use or try to enforce different regulations. And so really, I think the only time we should be starting to get super worried about inherency or neg uniqueness is if Congress starts passing a bunch of antitrust bills, which like may happen, but like given the current situation, given how long things like even infrastructure are going to take to pass, which I'd say is less bipartisan than antitrust now, but still rough. I don't think we have to worry too much. And I hope I don't eat my words on this. You can quote me if I do, but like I think the topic overall will be fine. But what also this means is when you're preparing on the negative, given that there is a lack of teeth for a lot of the different non-Congress asks, you should start preparing links and focus your strategy around those things. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for joining me for the lecture on antitrust today. It was very exciting to research this, and I'm looking forward to hearing y'all's thoughts and doing a formal Q&A at some point. Just like getting to talk to you all. I hope you all enjoy your summer with Debate Boutique, and I'll see you all later. Bye.